this total neglect. I mean, who knows that there is rampant armed conflict that kills thousands of people, displaces millions of people, and causes other millions of people going hungry? Who knows that that happens in the heart of Africa, in Burkina Faso? Very few.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Since 2019, Burkina Faso has been in a state of near constant conflict. Extremist groups control or occupy large swaths of the country. In the meantime, the government is extremely unstable and has been toppled in a succession of military coups. The military government in power today is generally hostile to the very same Western powers that have historically supported Burkina Faso with humanitarian and development assistance. My guest today, Jan Egeland, is president of the Norwegian Refugee Council, a large international humanitarian NGO. Each year, the NRC publishes a list of what it considers the most neglected humanitarian emergencies on the planet, and the crisis in Burkina Faso tops the list this year. Jan Egeland recently returned from Burkina Faso, and in our conversation, he explains why the crisis there is so challenging and what can be done to make Burkina Faso less neglected by the international community. Many of you probably have heard of Jan Egeland. He is a longtime international humanitarian official who once served as the top UN humanitarian official. And in a recent episode of our new podcast, To Save Us from Hell, I speak with Jan Egeland about his experience as the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and what advice he has for the new incoming top UN humanitarian official. To listen to that episode of To Save Us from Hell and other episodes of our new podcast, just follow the links in the show notes of this episode or visit globaldispatches.org. Thank you all, and now here is my conversation with Jan Egeland, president of the Norwegian Refugee Council. So, Jan, thank you so much for speaking with me. Before we get into the humanitarian crisis in Burkina Faso and why it's the most neglected crisis in the world, can I have you explain how Burkina Faso descended into conflict in 2019 and what that conflict looks like today?
Well, Burkina Faso was called Upper Volta some years back, I remember from my own youth. It was a quiet place in the heart of Africa. It was seen as stable. It was a favorite place of development agencies. There was hardly any humanitarian group dealing with emergencies because there wasn't that much emergencies and there was no war. We in the Norwegian Refugee Council, we were active in Burkina Faso, as it was then called, because we were aiding Malian refugees from the civil war next door in Mali. Then in 2018, 2019, various armed groups started to be active in Burkina Faso. And some came from the neighboring countries. Some had a jihadist agenda, a religious agenda. Some were extremists. Some seemed to spring out of ethnic groups. And then there was a harsh military response. Then there was more violence and action-reaction. And it then ended by Burkina Faso going from being the most stable place with no internally displaced people to have the most rapidly growing internal displacement because of violence problem on earth when I was there the first time in early 2020.
And there does seem to be this malignant relationship between jihadist violence and political instability, in which the violence begets a coup and coups beget more violence. There has been a succession of coups which has not helped stabilize the situation at all.
No, so Burkina Faso is now one in this string of nations in the Sahel. Again, the string of countries just south of the Sahara Desert in northern Africa. All of these countries have now military regimes: Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. And there is a real problem because the traditional donors of ours, Western powers, US, Canada, the Europeans, European Union, the Scandinavians, the Germans, the French, the Brits, they all have broken relations, or relatively broken relations, and to a varying degree, with these Central Sahelian countries where the crisis is deep, people are suffering, and we as humanitarians feel pretty much left alone to deal with the suffering of the civilian population.
So let me ask, what does the conflict in Burkina Faso look like for civilians? How has it impacted civilians? I know you were there recently. How does the civilian impact of this crisis compare to others in the region or throughout the world that you've visited and that you've confronted?
It is terrible, really. And what distinguishes this from other places with millions of people that have fled from the countryside, especially to various townships where they hope to be safer, is that there's total neglect. I mean, who knows that there is rampant armed conflict that kills thousands of people, displaces millions of people, and causes other millions of people going hungry? Who knows that that happens in the heart of Africa, in Burkina Faso? Very few. So it's this utter neglect, forgottenness that distinguishes the crisis in Burkina Faso, where, for example, there are now 39 towns, urban centers, that are besieged, blockaded, as they are called there, meaning you cannot go there at all without heavy armed escort. And in some places, even that doesn't make it through, which means again that we as humanitarians has to go with these very expensive helicopter transports to bring our humanitarian workers in and out, and also even some of the supplies for the starving population.
It does seem one thing that distinguishes Burkina Faso today is just how great a percentage of the population is in these blockaded areas. Just large swath of the country is beyond the conventional reach of humanitarian groups because these armed groups, mostly terrorist jihadist groups, are just seizing control of territory.
Indeed. I flew up in a helicopter. The United Nations has a World Food Program is running an essential air service for humanitarian organizations. So we went with these helicopters. It's called UNHAS.
UNHAS, the UN Humanitarian Air Service. It's
Exactly.
a branch of the World Food Program.
It is. And they flew us up to Dori, which is the capital of the Sahel region of northern Burkina Faso. It's a town that has several 100,000 inhabitants to start with. And now it's nearly doubled the population because it's filled with internally displaced from the countryside. The only way to reach Dori is by heavily armed, escorted convoys of trucks. And since we as humanitarians do not want to sacrifice our neutrality and our independence and be identified with one side to the conflict, we cannot take military escort. So our staff goes in and out on a helicopter, as I did. Mm-hmm. And there I saw widows with children who had fled for their lives when their village was torched, their livestock stolen, their husbands, male relatives were killed, and now they were destitute in the camps of Dori, where we as organizations were totally overstretched and underfunded, and the services that were provided are really minimal.
So you hinted at this earlier, but I am interested in having you explain more fully why you believe and why you've decided in your new report that Burkina Faso is the most neglected humanitarian crisis at the world. I mean, you mentioned earlier that the military regime there has indeed cut off relations with many of major conventional donor countries and is certainly tilting a bit towards Moscow. How else and why else did you decide that Burkina Faso is indeed the most neglected crisis in the world?
Well, we do research every year where we compare the largest displacement crisis on Earth, or rather concretely, every place that has more than 200,000 people displaced by war, conflict, violence, and natural disasters. There are 39 of them. We then measure the number of people displaced and in need with funding available per person in need, media attention. We monitor all published articles and media stories about the place and compared to the number of people in need. And thirdly, the number of diplomatic, political, developmental initiatives to end the crisis. When you come on the bottom of this list, or the top, if you like, the one that is least covered by all of these three indicators, you find Burkina Faso. Number two would be Cameroon. Then comes the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Then comes Burkina Faso, Sahelian neighbors, Niger and Mali. Then follows one country outside of Africa, the only one, which is Honduras. Then follows the Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Sudan. So you would see that 9 out of 10 of the most neglected emergencies on Earth are in Africa, and all 3 of the central Sahelian nations are on that list.
To what extent do you think that the attention given right now to the crisis in Gaza, and I don't want to diminish the immense humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza, but it is certainly getting a great deal of attention. To what extent does that shift donors' focus and shift public focus and public attention away from these other long simmering crises? I mean, do we have like an attention deficit disorder when it comes to these things?
That's part of it. Ukraine war in Europe has taken, really rightfully so, a huge amount of attention since the Russian invasion. Then the horrors of the 7th of October in Israel and the war in and on the Gaza population have taken also a lot of attention. But it's not the fault of the Ukraine and Gaza, as you yourself hint. That is the problem. I think it is that the media are decision makers, policy makers are really focusing on one crisis at a time. And that means that there is so little funding left for mega crises like the one in the Congo, which is the largest hunger crisis on earth, or Sudan, which is the largest displacement crisis on earth. It's not Ukraine, it's not the Middle East, it's Sudan, and it's the Congo. And if you look at the extreme neglect, you find the 3 Sahelian countries there. How come we're not able to cover with our solidarity all peoples who are in deep, deep crisis?
I mean, you've been at this for a while, so let me just ask you that question you just asked me. What will it take and what does it take? And how do you find a solution to the challenge of focusing policymakers' attention on these crises that are, not proximate to their capitals? They're not politically terribly relevant, but the suffering by the numbers is certainly profound. How do you kind of flip that script? And do you have like a solution to our problem of limited attention to humanitarian crises?
First of all, I think we who are there, who have it as a job to fight for the interests of and come with aid to and protection to people anywhere in the world where there is suffering, we need to be better in explaining that these places are not hopeless. These people are important. It is in conformity with our ideals. If we want to call us civilizations, and we do, we need to be willing and able to provide some assistance and some protection to women and children who are at the brink of the abyss. And we need to explain that. Number two, we need to fight for systems so that international assistance is more divided according to needs. We call it in humanitarian principles the impartiality principle. We shouldn't give according to race or creed or political affiliation or strategic interest. We should give according to need. And then I think we also have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, there is, I think, an inbuilt discrimination against Africa, because every time we make these lists, African countries come on the top in terms of neglect. We have to understand these protracted, deep crises in Africa. They're not, nor for that matter, in places like Afghanistan and Myanmar and even Colombia in the Western Hemisphere. They're not going away. And if they're not going away, that they are also a source of instability, even for us. We need to invest in hope in these regions.
So concretely on Burkina Faso, what are you urging of policymakers and donors right now?
Same in Burkina Faso and other deeply neglected places. Number one, let us cover the humanitarian needs. The humanitarian appeal was 15% funded when I was there 2 weeks ago, and we're mid-year.
Yeah.
Number two, do not take away development assistance as Western donors have because you don't like the regime. Channel it differently, but still to the people that are wanting. It's a deep crisis now, and it could merit another podcast, because we see in more and more crises that the traditional donors find that the regimes that take power, Taliban in Afghanistan, the military in Myanmar, the military across the Sahel, including Burkina Faso, and then they take away all development assistance, as if the women and children in the place were at fault. The development is not to the regimes, it's to the people in need. And then finally, reboot conflict resolution, diplomacy, solutions for these deep crises, because they're becoming so protracted.
Jan Egeland, thank you again so much for your time as always.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.